Hallelujah. How many of you know that the giants in your life are only as big as you allow them to be? Amen. And I believe, you can be seated if you want in heavenly places. This is going to be a rocket ride today, I believe. It's exciting to me because I believe we live in the single most defining times in the body of believers since our Messiah walked the face of the earth. And the only reason that I can say that I believe this is a greater season than that is simply because of the magnitude of the numbers that are involved in being collected from the four corners of the earth to comprise that body of Messiah. We're about to see some things unleashed in the earth that are going to stupefy, stagger, cause men's hearts to fail them for fear. And on the other hand, it's going to be a season when those that do know Him are going to do great exploits. And so I have to ask you, do you know Him? Come on now. Talk is cheap. Your lifestyle can tell whether or not you do, and I believe that you do. I want to welcome you to Remnant of Truth International, Manna from Heaven Ministries. We're going to look at the week's Torah portion, and prayerfully, if you'll allow me, we're going to indulge ourselves in the level of the Hebrew language that you probably haven't seen associated with this particular Torah portion before, and I simply believe it's because we're living in some prophetic times, and Father has given us here in the Pacific Northwest, I believe, and I say this with all humility because I will never step out and say, hey, I'm a prophet. I've never called myself a pastor. I just simply believe that this is what I do. This is what I am. This is not a job. And so without the anointing of the Ruach, I am nothing. But I also would be quick to believe that based on what Father has been revealing to us, that there is a prophetic anointing in this area. And Father is exposing some things, and that's what the prophets do. If you've got individuals that are calling themselves prophets and all they can do is to give you a get-rich-quick scheme or a name-it, claim-it message or send in this and we'll send you that, then I would suggest that you need to find somebody else to call a prophet, because the true prophets of old would always point back to the Torah and tell you to get your act together and return to the Torah. And then those same prophets would be quick to do just like what Shepherd John was saying, challenge the status quo that is the religious community today. And that's what's happening. Just in the last couple of weeks, I have probably been personally attacked more than the previous 10 years prior to that, simply because of some of the things that we've been espousing that I believe is in the Torah. And one of the things that I'm hearing people say is that oh my goodness, you're making some statements that how can you justify that in light of what we're seeing with our eyes in the public platform? And I'm telling you, your eyes are going to lie to you. Amen. Your ears are going to lie to you unless your flesh is under control. And that's why I believe this Torah portion is really important. The title of the Torah portion is Chukat. Say that with me, Chukat. Who got that? Numbers chapter 19, verse 1 through chapter 22. And it's got several notable events. If you've read, how many of you have read this Torah portion in your life? You know, that can kind of get you off the hook because probably didn't read it this week. Well, you know, it talks about Moshe striking the rock twice. It also gives us a little bit of a dissertation about how Edom refuses to allow Israel to pass through their land. You have the death of Aaron and Miriam. And then you have fiery serpents attacking Israel. And you have, last but not least, you have the conquest of Og of Bashan, who was one of the giants in the land. And I believe with what Shepherd John was saying, I am firmly convinced that we're going to see literal physical giants in the land again. We're going to have to stand against those enemies that are going to be unleashed out of the pit, and you better be prepared. If you don't know who your Messiah is, you're going to have a difficult time. But if you're like King David, you can gather up those stones to annihilate the ancestor of the giants that's going to be coming against you. But what I would like to focus on in this particular Torah portion that's entitled Chukat is one particular avenue that I believe is central to our understanding what Abba's role in allowing the Messiah to come down and take on the cloak, or if you will, or the flesh of a man, and then walk out some things that you see manifested in the natural throughout the wilderness sacrificial system. And one of those is the red heifer, the Chukat, or the statute of the red heifer. The sages teach that this ordinance of the red heifer is literally a decree beyond our understanding. And in Hebrew, that word for red heifer is parah adumah. Say that with me, parah adumah. Before we get too far into the red heifer specifically, I'd just like to look at the title portion and look at that word in the Hebrew, the word chukat. And it's interesting because it comes from a word that is plural, chukah, and that comes from the root stem, the word chok, and it means a statute, an ordinance, something that is appointed. It actually originates from a word that indicates to cut out, to reach in and surgically remove something so that you've left something else in its place. To inscribe, to engrave, and while you're doing that, you're setting something in motion or setting something up that will be used to govern. And it's not an accident because verse 10 of this particular Torah portion tells us that this particular kukot, this ordinance or statute of the red heifer, is an ordinance or a statute forever. Now, if you just take that on its face value, then it would lead you to believe, and the rabbis, and we'll touch this probably several times throughout the Torah portion, the rabbis believe that there have been 9 red heifers throughout history since Moshe slaughtered the first one. There's been 9 physical red heifers slaughtered for their purpose in the tabernacle setting, the temple setting, and yet there's a 10th one that's coming, and that the Messiah that arrives on the scene will slaughter the 10th one. And so I have to ask you, if in fact this is a statute forever, and we know that the wilderness sacrificial system was a temporal or a temporary system until Father could set in place the spiritual representation of that system, then do we really in fact need another red heifer to be slaughtered? I want you to keep that in your mind. And there are a lot of individuals that would say, when they hear me talking about this ordinance of the red heifer, first of all, not understanding the physical symbology behind it, then they won't understand its spiritual application. And a lot of our church brothers would be quick to tell you that the law's been done away with. We don't have to keep the law now. But yet they'll go over in Galatians chapter 3 around verse 13 and talk about being seed of Abraham. And yet in Genesis chapter 26, we're told that Abraham, long before Moshe arrived on the scene, that Abraham kept the mitzvot, the chukat, and the law, the Torah. He kept the commandments, he kept the statutes, and he kept the law, the Torah, long before we arrived at this particular event here at Mount Sinai. And so it seems as if there's an exposing that's being allowed to take place in that group that calls themselves believers today, so that we can pull back all of the religious fluff and excavate this thing down to the bare bones or to the bedrock so that we can see exactly what we're standing on. Because if you go back and read the New Testament example or the parable that Yeshua shared about the 2 men that built their house, one built his house on sand, the other man built his house on a solid rock. If you go back and just read that, you'll find that they both had the same vision. They evidently both had the same resources, because we're also told, how can you build a house or wage war without first counting the cost? And so it's evident that both of them had the means to do so, and both of them had the same materials and tools, and yet one built his own sand, which was shift, and the other one built his own bedrock. And I would have to ask you then, what is your house being built on? And there's a lot of our family members, a lot of our friends, a lot of Messianic Christian Hebrew roots teachers out there that are teaching things that, in my opinion, and I believe that truth will stand scrutiny. And so I don't mind you calling me on what I'm sharing with you, as long as you are digging down yourself and you have an informed opinion. But what I'm trying to share is that there's a lot of fluff that's been taught that I think Father's exposing in this season that we're living in. Do you believe that? I believe it. Now, the rabbis say that this word, the root of this word chukat, this word chok, is something that's incomprehensible. In other words, the mind of man can't even understand it. And they go so far to say that even Solomon, with all the wisdom that Solomon had, couldn't understand it. They say that it's an ordinance that exists specifically for one reason, and that's to test your obedience. How many of you have been tested lately? How many of you have been obedient to what you have been tested on? How many of you have heard a word from Abba, and yet you have procrastinated and have not moved, and you're just waiting on a confirmation? It's an ordinance that exists to test one's obedience simply because Abba said to do it. I find that there is some wisdom by times in testing the voices. But if you need more than 3 or 4 or 5 witnesses to give you a foundation for you to launch out on when you've heard from Abba, then I would suggest you need to back up and punt. You need to go back and find out, first of all, if you heard the voice or not. And maybe you did hear a voice, but you're just procrastinating. Procrastinators get left behind. Now, regarding these Chukat, these ordinances that require strict obedience, it's in my opinion, you see an example of this here in the Torah, because Moshe is instructed how to deal with this rock from which the living water would issue forth. And he's told initially to strike the rock. This time he's told to speak to it, but instead what does he do? He strikes the rock twice. This was a command that was given him that did require strict obedience without question, and yet it results in Moshe, because of all of the stuff that's going around, and I'm quite sure, and if you go back and look at it, Moshe actually tries later on to blame the people. Because of you, God was angry with me. How many of you tried the blame game lately? It's your fault that where I'm at. Well, I don't think so. It results in Moshe striking the rock twice in anger. And as a result, both he and Aaron receive a death penalty for their disobedience. Listen to that. This is not something to play with, because from what I understand, obedience or not is the difference between life or death. Are you hearing me? And so you have to ask yourself, is there a deeper connection in this Torah portion rather than just something we go back and look that's antiquated regarding the ashes of a red heifer? And I understand all of the mechanism behind it. I understand the science behind it. If you really do your due diligence, I was raised in the South. I understand what cleansing agents are. My grandmother used to make lye soap from ashes and water that was run through the ashes, and it had a caustic agent that was left behind, and she would make the soap. It's a cleansing agent. And so the ashes of the red heifer, literally as those ashes were taken and water was run through it with hyssop, these things literally become a caustic agent, sort of like a lye soap that would actually cleanse you from certain germs and things that you would come in contact with. That's the physical application. I understand that. But there has to be something far more than that. And I believe that as we look into this Torah portion, you're going to see some things regarding this statute, something that the natural mind cannot understand. And so you're going to have to look at this thing purely from a spiritual perspective. Are you listening? And as I was sitting here at my desk looking at it, I looked at the word Chukat and the numeric value, which is 508, and I found that it was closely related to another word that had the same numeric value. And sometimes I get castigated because I talk about numeric values and the gematria and, oh, you're a Kabbalist or you're involved in some of this mystical stuff. No, Hebrew is an alphanumeric language. Yahweh did that, not me. And so if I have a letter or a word that has a specific numeric value and there's another letter or another word or a combination of the two that have the same values, then Abba's the one, his mind and his thoughts, his ways are higher than ours, and he put those there for a reason, just like the word for Nakash and the word for Mashiach, 358, same numeric values. How are they related? Well, one is an archetype or a counterfeit of the other. And so if you understand this, you can kind of put things in their proper context. Well, this word Chukat comes from a root word that I found with the same value all the way back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 24. And when you're studying the scriptures, if you remember, the law of first reference is something that you can go back and put a nail in when you're trying to study and find out, what does this word mean? Where's the definition originate from? Well, let me go back and find the place that this word is first used, and I put a nail over here in Genesis chapter 3, verse 24, and so I go back to where I pegged this word garash at first, and I find, okay, this kind of sets a precedent for how I should treat this word from this time throughout the rest of the Torah. And then if you look at it within the frame of context, because if you don't understand context, if you don't have context with context, you have pretext, okay? And so context helps to give you definition. And so this word garash, which you see back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 24, actually is translated in the King James English as to drive out, to expel. It can be translated as divorce, to drive out from a specific possession. And so it's no doubt, in my opinion, and I believe that this is a studied opinion, not just something I've heard someone else say, and so I'm echoing that. We have a lot of people standing in platforms today that are just an echo. Are you listening? But if you look deeper, you have to remember in Genesis chapter 3 that Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, at this particular season, they represented the bride of Yahweh in the earth. And after the fall, they are found in what we know today as an unclean condition. And the reason that they are unclean is, first of all, they came in contact with the dead one. Listening to me? They actually contracted death. Listen to that word, contracted death. They engaged in a covenant contract with the dead one, and so because of that, death came on them, and it was passed forth down to all of the subsequent generations of the Adam until the day that our Messiah steps up and steps into the place of that dead one called the Adam. That last Adam becomes the living man, and he breaks that contract that we had with death. And so here you see that they have contracted death. And this is a specific reason that the red heifer ordinance was set in motion, is so that it could be used as a cleansing agent for all of those individuals that would have been tainted by having come in contact with a dead corpse. Listen to me. If you had to bury a loved one, guess what? You came in contact with death. You had to apply the red heifer ashes. That ritual cleansing had to be applied to you so that you could be cleansed and then have access to the temple. You could go about if you didn't intend on going into the temple or the wilderness tabernacle, then you didn't have to come in contact with it. It was so that you could be clean in order to come into the sanctuary of the Most High. Think about that. But if you did not go through the means of ritual cleansing with this red heifer offering, this red heifer sacrifice, then not only were you denied access to the sanctuary where the presence of the Creator would reside, but you would also be cut off forever from the house of Israel. Now you need to think about this. If these don't have merit to us today, then why is that important? Okay? And I'm convinced that Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, not only were they guilty of coming in contact with the dead one, but something transpired in addition to that, just being in the area where you reach out and touch, because she touches the dead one. And then they engage in sexual perversion with this entity, this Nakash, whatever you want to call him here at the tree of carnal knowledge, and they are also now guilty of adultery. And it's not an accident that from a Torah perspective, adultery requires a death penalty. Isn't that amazing? Now, let me just share this with you. It is my personal opinion, and again, it's not just something I pull out of the hat. This is something that I've studied for years. I believe that every precept regarding our relationship with the Creator, everything that has to do with the redemptive process that was, I believe, foreshadowed in all of the sacrificial elements of the wilderness tabernacle, all of those things you can find first typed, if you will, or typified, including this ordinance of the red heifer all the way back here in Genesis. Now that's a sobering statement. We'll look at it and you'll see what I'm talking about. So, based on what I've shared with you thus far, we can reckon that the act of adultery is actually related to touching the dead or touching the dead one. And if you go study ancient Near Eastern cultures, you'll find that if the husband whose wife had been guilty of adultery, he could actually have her killed, but if he decides, instead of having her killed, if he decides he's going to divorce her, instead of having the death penalty applied, then it required a forfeiture of the wife's ketubah, or the wedding vows that they had shared together, and all of the promises that he had promised her prior to their getting married. Now they're abrogated, they're broken. Now remember that. Adam and Eve come in contact with the dead one. Adam and Eve commit adultery. Adam and Eve had a ketubah. Adam and Eve had a wedding covenant contract with the Creator in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, and that is abrogated in chapter 3. From that time forward until there's someone who makes a propitiation for that, to rectify that, they have no ketubah. They have no wedding covenant. the promises have been disavowed. Does that make sense to you? It puts you in a compromising position. You hear what I'm saying? Now, again, as I was sharing earlier, another thing that's peculiar to this red heifer ordinance is that its ashes are necessary to allow access to the tabernacle of Yahweh. And based on what we've shared with you in the past, I believe personally, again, that the wilderness tabernacle was actually laid out, designed, if you will, in the form of a man. And so the wilderness tabernacle, in effect, represented the dead Adam. The dead Adam laying on the earth, and this dead Adam, from that time forward until the Messiah comes, he is in need of a continual cleansing until such time as the living last Adam could present a tabernacle, this tabernacle, not made with hands. Does that make sense? And you were part of that living tabernacle, the living stones tabernacle. And until the body of Messiah is presented in the earth, then that death that had worked through the Adam and all of Adam's generations had not been conquered. That's why when Yeshua comes, you hear the cry of victory. Oh, death, where's your sting? Grave, where's your victory? Why? Because Yeshua broke that death sting off of us. But I submit to you that even though the wilderness tabernacle no longer stands, and we understand that there is in fact a spiritual tabernacle that's being built, and Peter calls you a living stone that is set upon the foundational stone of Messiah, and we are that living stones tabernacle. I submit to you that the living stones tabernacle is still in need of a parah adamah, a red heifer. Even though the spiritual tabernacle supplanted the wilderness tabernacle or the temple. And so this kind of presents a conundrum, because if we are in fact in need of a red heifer, back to the proposition that the sages give us, that the Messiah is going to come and offer a 10th red heifer, the red heifer itself is a shadow picture. It's a pattern. And that particular ritual could only be sufficient as a fleshly cleansing agent, and it didn't have the ability to cleanse you from spiritual death. Do you understand what I'm saying? If it did, then all of those that came in contact with the red heifer ashes would have been spiritually clean, and death would not have ever been on them again. Does that make sense? Are you seeing me? So you have to ask yourself, where does this spiritual cleansing agent known as the parah adamah that we're in need of right now, where does that come from? Is it indeed going to be something that happens to us in the future? Is there indeed? And I'll be honest with you, back when we were in Mississippi, we had a relationship with one of the gentlemen that was responsible for raising up red heifers and getting them to Israel, and we watched that very eagerly, and we watched it closely until my eyes began to be open, and I understand what I'm going to share with you before we're through this afternoon. And most people are fixated on that red heifer, because you got to have the red heifer to cleanse the place where the temple is going to be built. You got to have the red heifer to cleanse all of those that come in contact with the temple. Okay, if that's the need, then let me ask you this. Why wasn't for the last 2,000 years, when there's been no temple, there's been no red heifer, what happened to all of our Jewish brothers in that short 2,000-year period of time? It's kind of sobering, isn't it? If their salvation actually hinges on these rituals, then it puts them in a pretty serious predicament, doesn't it? Hello? To help you understand this, and I'll be honest with you, as I was sitting at my desk and Abba began to take me in this direction that you're about to see, and I call it a sidebar, it just literally did not make any sense. And it didn't seem as if it fit this Torah portion. You remember I shared with you the word Chukat has a numeric value of 508. And I told you that it had the same numeric value as that word garash or garasha in Genesis chapter 3, verse 24. Remember that? And so I saw that there's such a close relation with those numeric values. It bears going back and scrutinizing and looking at it with a microscope. And if you go back and look at that word garasha, it's quite often mistranslated or misinterpreted, because it's closely related to a word that is in Genesis chapter 3, verse 23, and that's that word shalach. And the King James translators, from Genesis all the way to the end in the New Testament, quite often mistranslate this word shalak. And it's important for you to see this. That word shalak is translated as to send out, to send away, to let loose. And as I was saying, the King James translators quite often, more often than not, translate that word as divorce instead of just to send someone away. In fact, it's where you get the word, the root of the word for an apostle, a shalak, a sent one. And I want to give you a couple of verses for you to consider before we go too much further. And you can see that there in Genesis chapter 3. It says, therefore Yahweh Elohim sent Shalak, him, the Adam, forth from the Garden of Eden, and he sent him forth to till the ground from whence he was taken. So he drove out. Well, this is not the word Shalak here, it's the word Garash. He drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. Now, Yahweh does not mince words. And so I want you to understand what's about to transpire here, because when you look at these two words together, Shalak versus Garash, they're usually presented to you almost interchangeably. And yet, they are very seldom seen, like you just saw here in verse 23 and 24, they're very seldom seen coupled together. When they are seen coupled together in the context that you're going to see in a few minutes, it's important for you to notice, and I'll give you some examples. I could only find 4. The first one in there is what I call the garden expulsion. And then the second was in Genesis chapter 21, where Sarah speaks to Abram and she says, I want you to shalak garash Hagar. The third instance I found is in Exodus chapter 6, verse 1, where Yahweh speaking to Moshe regarding what is going to transpire with Pharaoh as a result of all of the plagues. He says, Pharaoh is going to shalak garash you. And then finally in Exodus chapter 3, verse 28, when Yahweh tells Moshe and the children of Israel, when you go into the land of Canaan, I'm going to send hornets, and we don't have time. Maybe we could get into that because there's some powerful stuff there. I'm going to send out hornets, and I don't believe it's the little stinging flying insects. I'm going to send out these hornets, and they're going to shalak garash all of the Nephilim, the Hivite, Canaanites, and Hittites that will be there in the land. Now, I want you to pay attention because it's important to see the connection with this word Chukat and this word Garashah. On every other occasion, you see these two words, they're separated and not occurring within the same framework or context. And as I said, and Brittany mentioned this last week, context helps you to determine definition. All right? And so, if I call you a lawless one, then I need to know where law, whether it's anomia in the Greek or Torah in the Hebrew, I need to know where that was first used so that I can go back and find out if I am in fact lawless. In other words, I'm without Torah or not. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Now, for clarity's sake, this word shalak means to send or to put away, while the word garashah or garash is harsh. It's a term that has finality to it. It's used specifically to emphasize a divorce. But what does garash have to do with this chukat, this ordinance of the red heifer? Hopefully I can answer this for you. Again, after what I've been looking at, it's my opinion that the word shalak is simply a putting away, much like the ancient Near Eastern customs where a man could send his wife away on a whim. If she didn't cook good, you're gone out of here. He would tell her, shalak, get out. Okay? He could do that according to the ancient Near Eastern customs without divorcing her, and therefore, based on that, she was not free to remarry again, and so she was literally, for all intents and purposes, a slave forever to that original contract. The other word, garash, always, without fail, involves the issuing of what we refer to in the Hebrew community as a get, a bill of divorce. And if you were issued a get, a garashah, a bill of divorce, you were lawfully released and thus free to remarry. Now, the church community, and I happen to be a byproduct of a divorce. My first wife walked off and left me with 3 little girls to raise by myself. She walked out and gave me the choice to, either serve Yahweh or it's me, and I had to make the decision. But the reason I'm sharing this with you, I'm trying to frame it within the context of Scripture, because people that have been through divorces have been looked upon as if they had what is an unpardonable stain upon them. Are you listening to me? And the reason for that is because of the simple misinterpretation. Well, I believe this has been intentional. And if you don't understand this, then you'll never understand the purpose of the red heifer's ashes, because if you come in contact with the dead one, you've committed adultery. Are you listening to me? And based on that, you can never be taken in marriage again. So whose bride are you? Are you listening? The issuance of a get, go back and read Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, dissolved the marriage covenant. Without a get, the man or woman who remarried would be illegally married and guilty of adultery. This is why Yahweh both shalaks, Genesis chapter 3, go back and read it. He says, he shalaks and garashas. He sends Adam and Eve out, and he issues them a get, a bill of divorcement. As a result, now this is mind-staggering, because as a result, if he had just sent them away, they would have still been bound and could never have been remarried, but they would have also been eternally condemned and could never have aspirations of redemption had it not been for Yahweh divorcing them so that they could be lawfully free to receive another ketubah from our Messiah, Yeshua. Do y'all see that? For context sake, and I've heard this from Malachi chapter 2, I've taught on this a bunch of times. It's this word shalak, or putting away, not garash or garashah. It's the word shalak that Yahweh says he hates in Malachi chapter 2, verse 16. Go back and read it. For without the garashah, the get, the wife is still the wife of your covenant, and you deal treacherously with her by simply putting her away. If you don't give her the get, then you have kept her enslaved. And it was such a strong point of contention that, how many of you remember the Sermon on the Mount? Do you know what the Sermon on the Mount really is? It's the establishment of kingdom law and principles. And Yeshua in Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32, deals with this issue of shalak versus gerashah. Now this is important, because if you don't get this, you will never understand how to properly apply the cleansing waters of the red heifer ashes to your life. Does that make sense? You'll never be able to be fully cleansed from the contagion known as death. Now in Matthew chapter 5, this is what it says in the King James English. Notice this. Now how many of you have read this before? It has been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. And then there's a strong conjunction that starts this next sentence. But I say unto you that whosoever shall put his wife away, except for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery. If you just read that without going back and understanding what I've just been sharing with you, you'll find that woman, even though she asks for forgiveness if she's committed adultery, even though she seeks that forgiveness and changes her lifestyle, she is damned forever based on what most church people believe. Are you hearing me? Pay attention to that word but. It's mistranslated. It's mistranslated as if Yeshua is changing some things. It looks as if Yeshua is changing Deuteronomy chapter 24. If a woman commits adultery, or the husband, then you issue a get. It looks as if Yeshua is changing that from the King James English. Because that word in English, that word but, indicates on the contrary, or to the contrary, or instead, and it indicates opposition to the preceding statements. In other words, it looked as if Yeshua is taking exception to issuing a bill of divorcement. If you look at if you look at the Greek word that's used here and translated as but in the King James English, it's the word de. Say that with me, de. and it means moreover, in addition. So what's happening here is that Yeshua's not changing what's said in Deuteronomy chapter 24. He's actually expounding upon it, and he's making it very clear, because if you go back and look there, the Greek word for both put away and divorce in this text is the word apolio, which is equivalent to the word shalak. Yeshua's dealing with putting the woman away without giving her a bill of divorcement. And then he takes a very strong approach. He says, he's speaking to those men that were listening that had been disobedient. There were a lot of them in that particular crowd that had put their wives away and had taken other wives. Those that had been put away had not been given a bill of divorcement, so those men that supposedly were remarried also had additional wives. They had undivorced, sent-away wives, and Yeshua did. What was ironic here is that Yeshua was not commanding them to give a bill of divorcement to the woman that they said that they were currently married to, because they weren't legally married to her to begin with. They still were legally married without the get. They were still legally married to the one they'd sent away. And so what he's saying, look, you're shacking up. Get rid of the one you're shacking up with and go and give the bill of divorcement to the one that you have caused to be in exile for this length of time. Are you hearing me? So did Yahweh hate divorce? No. Yahweh hated the fact that the husbands were separating from their wives without giving them a certificate of divorce, which would have enabled them to get remarried. This is what Yahweh hates. The ability to remarry after a divorce is the will of Yahweh. Yahweh had divorced Israel. Scripture says that. Without what I'm sharing with you this afternoon, you would have no hope. When he says, I hate putting away, it's not the divorce. He's saying, go back and read it for yourselves. It's the shalak, the separation without the get, which prohibits the spouse from being free. That's what Yahweh says he hates. In all of the cases that you find these two words together, Yahweh is sharply contrasting the two so that you can understand the difference between simply being put away and given a bill of divorcement. And in each of those four cases that I shared with you, that's what's taken place. So what does the Chukat, the ordinance of the red heifer, this statute that is eternal, this statute that is so mind-numbing that you really can't understand it from the natural, what does it have to do with divorce? If it is related to the word garashah. What does it have to do with this Torah portion? What does it have to do with the red heifer? Well, let's back up for a second. I want to call your attention to Numbers chapter 19, verse 2. Look at what is being said here. This is really strong. This is the ordinance of the Torah which Yahweh hath commanded, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel that they bring you a red heifer without spot, wherein is no blemish, and upon which never came a yoke. That verse begins with a statement in my mind that's inscrutable. You look at it, in the King James English, you can't see it. You look at it in the Hebrew, and your head gets numb. It says this, Zot Chukat HaTorah. This is the ordinance of the Torah. And when you read it, it's actually giving a summation. If you've ever been into a court of law, when the two opposing attorneys are called on to give their final word, it's a summation of what everything's been said, and the summation kind of encapsulates everything. What it's literally saying here is that this ordinance of the red heifer is actually the summation, or contains within it the summation or the entirety of the Torah. And so you have to understand the red heifer, or in my opinion, you can't understand the Torah if what we've just read is the truth. And the rabbis quickly acknowledge that you can't understand it. And let me just remind you that the red heifer is completely and wholly consumed. It's burned. And with it, after it's consumed, or mixed cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet, bring a water in the name of a prophet, receive a prophet's reward. Hyssop and scarlet are cast into the fire as well. Those ashes become the method of purification, not only from sin, but from cleansing, the cleansing method that's needed if you, as I've said all this time, if you come in contact with a dead body, whether it was an animal. And if you study history, you know that because of this particular ritual here, our Jewish brothers, and in addition to that, their kashrut laws, keeping kosher, kept them from dying off through the ages with things like bubonic plague and some of the other things when you come in contact with dead things. Does that make sense? Based on what the Torah says, if you come in contact with a dead body, you have to apply the ashes, the cleansing waters of the red heifer's ashes, and you're unclean for 7 days. But that's not just it. You have to first purify yourself with the ashes of the red heifer, and then you have to go before the priest on the 3rd day and present yourself. He can look at you and say, oh, it looks like you got a rash. In other words, you may have come in contact with something that the first washing didn't take care of, so we're going to wash you again. And then after that 3rd day, you are presented on the 7th day, and he then pronounces you as clean, okay? If you don't apply yourself to this particular ritual, then you defile the tabernacle, and as I said earlier, you will be cut off from the house of Israel. So I got to ask you this. It's quite evident that we come in contact from the natural dead things. And we come in contact with dead things spiritually. There's no standing temple. There's no ashes of the red heifer. Oh, I know that they're looking for them. In fact, the Temple Mount Institute puts out things saying that they may have found some. How do we know that's the right ones? It's been several thousand years. How do we know that's the right ones? You understand? Well, we just got to wait until a red heifer comes. How do I know that this red heifer that's coming has no spot or blemishes? I got to take their word. My life's on the line here. Do you see what I'm saying? And so there's no standing temple, there's no ritual, there's no priesthood to officiate this. So what keeps me from being cut off? See, these are things that we need to ask ourselves, and then not only do we need to be able to ask them, but we need answers. And so what have we learned so far? We've learned that this Chukat ritual cleanses us from contact with dead things. We've learned that adultery is also related to touching dead things. And you can see that, first of all, the law first reference in Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Chava commit adultery, and they touched the dead one, the Nakash. Romans 5:12 puts it really simply. For as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. Every one of us have to apply the cleansing waters of the red heifer to our lives, but based on what I read here, the red heifer can't cleanse me from death, or there would have been no need of Yeshua coming to liberate me from death. Does that make sense to you? This is not rocket science, is it? Now, there's another connection. Is this helping anybody? There's another connection that you can find in Numbers chapter 5, and you see this connected with what we would refer to as the waters of jealousy, the bitter waters of jealousy, where water, hyssop, and dust from the tabernacle floor are commingled together, and they're poured into a glass, if you will. They're poured actually across a parchment where the accusations were written against the woman who's going to drink it. It's poured across that. It washes the accusations against her, blotting them out, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that were against her. The Torah wasn't nailed to the law, to the tree. It was because Yeshua came and fulfilled the ritual of the red heifer and drank the bitter waters of jealousy, and then he blotted out the accusations of adultery that were against us. Those accusations are washed into that cup, and she's forced to drink it. If she's not guilty, then she conceives seed and she has children. If she is guilty, her belly and thigh rots out. Now, if you read this in Numbers chapter 5, initially you say, wait, we got you there, because it doesn't mention the ashes of the red heifer. So how could they be connected? Well, if you look at the word dust there, it's the word afar. ayin pei resh. The word for ashes, is aleph pei resh. One time I was teaching on some of these sacrifices back home, and some, y'all may not have the problem, but sometimes my mind moves faster than my mouth does, okay? And I was reading the part where it talks about the fat ashes that are left after a sacrifice, and they have to be taken out of the camp and get taken out of the house. And I said, we need to get the fat ashes out of the house. And it didn't come out exactly that way. And some people took exception to that. But this word for dust has the same root as the word for ashes. The aleph and the ayin are letters that have no articulation. They have no vowel pointings. The vowels have to be supplied to them. Does that make sense? And so if you look at the root stem is the peresh, which is the same root as that as the parah adamah, the red heifer. And so what you find in Numbers chapter 5 is a close relation to the ashes of the red heifer ritual. And it's interesting because when you look at that word peresh, in Hebrew it indicates, it can indicate a calf or a cow, but it also indicates the fruit of one's lips. What comes out of your mouth is fruit. Fruit is something that has been born. Are you listening to me? The seed is when it's in your mind. Once it comes out of your mouth, it can be both seed and fruit. How many of you know that unless it's genetically modified, fruit has seed in it? Is this making sense to you? And so I conceive the seed in my mind. When I speak it out of my mouth, it becomes fruit. This is something that's just been birthed out of me. But it also has the potential within it. As it matures, it has the seed within it as well. Does that make sense? And so if you look at the word parah adamah, it's interesting because it has the same numeric value as the word Mount Sinai, 335. And that's not an accident because at Mount Sinai, the golden calf incident occurs. How many of you remember the golden calf incident? Do you know what happens there? The same thing that we just got through reading with the bitter waters of jealousy and the ashes of the red heifer. Because as soon as Moshe comes down, finds them getting involved in this sexual, idolatrous, perverted issue that's going on, religious worship, he takes the golden calf and he has it ground into dust, mingles with water, and they have to drink it. And if you don't know these rituals, you won't understand why Levi was able to go into the community and slay certain people out of hand. How did Levi know? He just went in arbitrarily just to kill off those that he could reach with a sword? No. If they followed this ritual, the ones that were guilty of adultery, their belly immediately began to swell. And so Levi knew who was guilty, and Levi could take care of business. See what I'm saying? These judgments mirror one another. It's also not an accident when you look at the numeric value of the word opar, or for ashes, and the word for dust, ephar. Their total value is 631. And this began to stagger me because I'm trying to take dictation as I hear the Holy Spirit sharing these things with me. And sometimes he moves faster than my mind can comprehend, and all I can do is write things down, and then I have to go back and look at it. But this number 631 is the same as an italicized phrase. Well, I'm actually italicizing it. The same as this phrase in Daniel 7, verse 25. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, talking about the anti-Messiah in the days ahead. And he will wear out. Remember I said words are fruit with seed in it. And he shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given unto his hand until a time and times and the dividing of times. Ad idan ve'edin upelach idan has the same numeric value of those two words combined. And I thought, my goodness, is there a connection to something that is going to take place in the midst of this 3.5 year period? This phrase is actually associated with the covenant of peace that the anti-Messiah signs with Israel, and midway during the 7 years or the 3.5 years of this tribulation period, this thing's going to be abrogated, and it looks as if something regarding the red heifer and that ritual is going to be needed for application during that period of time. Could there be a future relationship with the waters of jealousy and a need for cleansing during the judgment of the great tribulation upon the harlot known as Israel? Now bear in mind, the rabbis teach that the Chukat of the red heifer originated as a result of what I just shared with you, the sin of the golden calf. I believe that that ritual can be traced all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. They call the sin of the golden calf the Chata Ha'egel, the sin of the calf. Now, this ritual would only satisfy our Jewish brothers if there's a standing temple. But what does this ritual do for those of us that call ourselves part of the Living Stones tabernacle at present? Now, it's interesting because if you just back up and look at that phrase that I shared with you, the Chata Ha'egel, the sin of the calf, it also has a numeric value. And this is not an accident. I just didn't go looking for these numbers. The numeric value is 124, the same as that word Eden, times. And the same as the word Mahdi, the name that's given to the Islamic Messiah, who I personally believe that the coming anti-Messiah, and I'm going to just make sure you understand me, I believe that the coming anti-Messiah will actually stand in a role having combined the triad of the world's great religions together. I believe that it will be Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and I believe that he will combine the three together and stand underneath that title in this office that he's going to assume in the days ahead. I believe that he will combine those roles. Call me what you want. Back it up if you will. The mem prefix of the word Mahdi indicates a womb and symbolizes birth and origin, the place of the seed. If you look at what's left, the ayin dalet yod, that root carries the idea again of time, specifically a designated time, while it's also hinting at an unclean condition in the midst of that designated time, because the ayin dalet root is where you get the word nidah from, which means a menstrually unclean season. And what does a menstrual cycle represent? It's the dead blood with the dead seed in it. And so it's this coming Mahdi who is going to attempt to impregnate Israel at a specific season of uncleanness that's going to be associated with another future event wherein sexually perversive, idolatrous practices are going to be involved. And so I had to ask myself, do you think that there may be another future golden calf incident that'll be taking place while Moshe was on top of the mountain receiving the ketubah for the genuine bride? At that very same time, the part of the house was down there prostituting themselves. Are you seeing what's about to happen? We call ourselves the bride. Do you think that there's part of those that should be part of the bride of Messiah? Do you think that there'll be part of that bride that will be prostituted in the days ahead at another future incident like this? I believe that there's going to be a replication of this very episode at a future event where once again Israel, just like Adam and Chava, are going to touch the dead one represented by this golden calf. And if you remember, as soon as this golden calf comes out and it's been formed miraculously according to Aaron, the statement is made, "These be thy gods." Could it be possible that is going to once again be heard at a time when the wedding ketubah is being readied for the bride of Yahweh, known as Israel? Could it in fact coincide with a future event known as the Abomination of Desolation, which I believe would be the installation of this Mahdi, this false Messiah, upon a counterfeit throne in a counterfeit temple with a counterfeit system, priestly system that's going to use the people in an untoward manner? I don't know if I believe that. Well, let's just stop and go back and look at where this phrase is first seen. Daniel chapter 11, verse 31. The abomination that makes desolate. In Hebrew, that phrase is hashakut meshumim, abomination of desolation. Because of our traditional viewpoint, and I'm going to share this with you. I've been in the ministry for better than 35 years. And I've heard just about everything that could be taught regarding end-time prophecy and what we're to expect in front of us. And let me just share to you, if you are also a student of end-time prophecy and you're where you are now based on what you've been hearing for the last 35 and 40 years, you need to throw that, I almost said crap. I almost said throw that crap away. I'm sorry. You need to throw that junk away and start digging things out of the Hebrew language in the Torah, because Abba's pulling back the cover to reveal to us that we have had tunnel vision. This word shakutz is used to describe the most detestable of idolatrous practices. Do you know what idolatry is? No, you don't? Oh, the worship of false idols, right? An icon that's supposed to represent a god. Well, it's not the carved wooden image that you're worshiping. That carved wooden image is a point of reference. It's a focal point. What you're actually worshiping, if you're worshiping an icon or an idol, you're actually worshiping that fallen deity that's represented by or personified by that idol. Does that make sense? And so when you think of the word idol, you're actually guilty of adultery at the same time. Idolatry is the spiritual thing that takes place, and adultery is when you physically enact that worship, because worship is a religious practice, if you will allow. It's an intimate sexual practice, without getting too graphic. Does that make sense to you? And so this word shakutz is the most detestable of idolatrous practices. And further, that word shamim, which is translated as desolation, it also, now this blew my mind, because we're talking about the coming abomination of desolation in front of us. We already know, based on shakutz meshumim, that something that is so detestable that a rational thinking man would detest it and abhor it, right? But the word desolation here indicates something that's so horrific that as soon as people see it, it will take something, a noisy place where there is a large calamitous noise and crowd, it would take that crowd and just stifle them, and you'd automatically go silent. Your mouth would be agape as you witness what's taking place in front of you. And that same word shamim points towards an individual being deflowered. The word deflowered literally means you have lost your virtue. It points to one being deflowered or ravaged while taking place during a religious worship ceremony. Is it possible that something that's so detestable is going to take place in front of us? Is it possible that it's the sanctuary that is supposedly dedicated to Yahweh could in fact be a counterfeit building with a counterfeit priestly system and a dead God? Because there is a dead God going to come and sit on that throne that is said to be the throne of the King of creation. That throne and that intimate place should be reserved for the husband and bride. And is it possible that this dead God sitting on that throne is going to deflower the bride, to take away the virtue of the bride of the King of creation as she comes in to, whether she is ignorant or not, as she comes in to worship Him? Are you hearing what I just said? It's my opinion that this event is going to involve a public display of such sexual perversion with a god or gods. Now, let me just stop here and interject. That you have probably, if you've been listening to any of the news of late, you have probably heard more about aliens and UFOs in the last month than you have in the last 10 to 15 years. You are being prepared for an invasion. Revelation chapter 12 says that when he realizes he is going to be cast down to the earth, and when he realizes that his time is short, that he is going to be wroth. He's going to be foaming at the mouth. And talking about the Hasatan and his emissaries. They are going to be revealed again in the days in front of us, and they're going to descend. I believe that there will not only be just a God, but probably a pantheon of gods inside this one individual that will descend upon a counterfeit throne, just as Isaiah 14:13 said Lucifer would do. Isaiah 14:13 says regarding Lucifer, I will sit, yeshav. That word in Hebrew indicates to cohabitate as in marriage. It's a very intimate sexual term. I will yeshav upon the mount, mount. It indicates to be pregnant or to impregnate. The congregation, the moed, the set times. Listen to this. And he tells you where he's going to do it, in the sides of the north. By the way, I believe the first instance of that is in Genesis chapter 3, because you need to go back and read Ezekiel's wheel, within the wheel. Because I'm convinced that the tree of carnal knowledge stood in the north location of Gan Eden, which would have been the sides of the north. And so he literally does exactly what he says in Isaiah chapter 14. He comes down to this place known as the sides of the north, and he comes down during a set time. Adam and Eve, I believe, were coming to the garden at a set appointed time, because we read later that the Messiah is walking, the voice is walking in the cool of the day, and the Nakash comes in, and he gets involved in sexual perversion right there, in my opinion. Now, listen to me. The future temple, all you have to do is go back and research it. This future temple, this third temple that's going to be built, is also going to sit in the sides of the north as it's located regarding Jerusalem. I will sit in the sides of the north. And the participants are going to touch the dead one. The numeric value of Hashakut Meshomem is 927, the same as the Hebrew phrase Makur Yisrael. Now that phrase can be translated two different ways. Makor is the Hebrew word for fountain. And the fountain of Israel is a unique term that's associated with Yahweh, because he is the fountain or life source of Israel. On the obverse side of that, it could also indicate the menstrual flow of a nidah, or a dead seed. Did you hear me? And so the abomination of desolation is going to be a direct contrast between the two. And as I've been saying, the Chukat of the red heifer is a cleansing agent for both the dead and adultery. And that law first reference comes into play back there in Genesis chapter 3. Now listen to me carefully. You remember the phrase Eden, Eden, 4 times. It also happens to be the same root that the word Eden for garden is taken from. Are you listening to me? It's not a coincidence that the event takes place in the garden, Gan. That word Gan there is an enclosed or a fenced-off place, and it means that it is a place where you can be defended and surrounded. The word Eden, Ayan Dalet Nun, there's that word Eden, that I was just sharing with you, times, can also be translated as in the midst of times. I've said before that Eden was the garden of appointed times. And so is it possible that Adam and Kavah were actually in the 3.5 years in the midst of a 7-day, 7,000-year plan? And I believe what you're doing, you're actually seeing Yahweh standing before, in the middle, and at the end of time, and showing you what is about to happen. While in the midst of this garden, they were supposed to be protected in the Eden. And they were supposed to be protected in the times when the Nakash would be coming down to visit. Are you seeing that? It leads me to believe, since these times allude to an encounter with the Creator, where they would, at that encounter with the Creator, they would enter into the tabernacle of His presence in a holy condition. That was exactly what was intended when the voice was walking in the cool of the day. But it was also hinting of the possibility at the same time of another encounter. Now you need to hold on to your seat for this, because the serpent or the Nakash was allowed access to that location. How did he get there? If Yahweh said you can't ever go there, he would never have went. He was allowed access. And at the moment that he presents himself to the Adam and Eve in his dead condition, it's actually the same as the tohu vabohu, waste and desolate condition of creation. And so there has to be a cleansing agent there, because he has to be put out of that place because he's bringing death in there. He's allowed to come in because it's fulfilling the redemption plan of Yahweh. Yahweh wanted Adam to apply the ashes of the red heifer to this entity and get him out, extricate him, drive him out, divorce him out, and cleanse this place for eternity. The sprinkling of the ashes, the parah adamah. The word parah, first fruit of the lips. Let me ask you this. This is not rocket. Who was the first fruit of the lips of Yahweh? The word of Yahweh became flesh in the earth. The Messiah, Yeshua, is the parah. He is the first fruit. He is the vocalized. He is the summation, the epitome of the word of Yahweh, the first fruit that was released in the earth. The word of Yahweh became flesh in the earth. And not only was he the fruit, but he then had seed in him so that he could reseed or refruit the rest of the earth. Is that right? If you look at the peresh root of the word parah, it indicates that very thing. And then you put the hay on the end of it, it indicates the ability to birth something. The numeric value of parah, 285, happens to be the same as the Hebrew phrase eriyah, from which we get erom, to be made naked. And so Adam, the first red heifer, Adam was the first parah adamah. He was the first vocalized fleshly man in the earth, the first Adam with the ability to replicate seed. He was supposed to speak to the dead condition that the Nakash brought into the Gan Eden, the protected place. He was supposed to release the word, the fruit of the Adamah, which was nothing less than the residue. The dust is the residue of the word. And he was supposed to speak that and therefore cleanse that area, and he failed to do so. And because of that, he and Chava instead are made naked. Can you see that? Do you think maybe that this is a prophetic symbol of the future place of protection that we're going to have in the midst of Va'idin, the 3.5 years of great tribulation? I believe Abba has a place of protection for his people. There's a collective phrase there in Genesis 3 verse 19, and that phrase is dust of the ground. Adam is told that you are dust from the earth. You came from the Adamah, and you're going to return to the dust. And it's interesting because if you look at it, it's ve'al efer teshuv. To dust you shall return. It's interesting because that word al there could also be translated as by. And so what is happening here, Adam and Eve have taken death upon them, and what Yahweh's telling them, listen, I am providing you a cleansing agent. You're going by the very dust that you were, the Adamah. There's another one coming from that same Adamah. He's going to have the residue of the creative power, living word in him, and by that Adamah, that afar, that residue, that dust, you will be allowed to make teshuvah. Why? Because he's going to sprinkle you. He's going to release the living water of his word upon you, and that's what Adam was supposed to have the ability to do. Afar, ayin peresh. Peresh, as I said, indicates the fruit of the lips, while the ayin indicates a well or a repository. You should be, instead of walking around telling everyone, I'm going to return to the dust. No, I am the dust, because I am a walking repository of the word of Yahweh. I have the residue. See, the dust is the residue of the Adamah. I have the residue. I am a parah Adamah. Are you hearing me? Yahweh is establishing the protocol of the Parah Adamah right here in Genesis chapter 3. And if you follow the pattern of the red heifer ritual, you'll find it there to be unclean for 7 days or 7,000 years. Following that protocol, they present themselves on the third day to 3,000 years at Mount Sinai. And they're looked upon, and there's still a contagion of death. And so at the end of the 7,000 years, which is right in front of us, we're going to be presented to him again. It's the ashes of this red heifer and the format that Yahweh supplied to us that's going to make us able to return, make teshuvah, to Eden's former condition. This pattern is imperative to follow, as this Chukat requires absolute obedience. I'm convinced as a result of that pattern, Yahweh established a living rehearsal every seventh day. A seventh-day Shabbat gives you the opportunity to present yourselves in rehearsal of the sprinkling of the cleansing waters that will wash you on a cyclical basis in anticipation of the day when you will be spiritually cleansed forever. Say amen. Now, context becomes the proof that the Chukat of the Parah Adamah was first implemented back in Genesis chapter 3 as a fail-safe method to ensure, listen to this, to ensure that the bride and later Israel, even though they had been issued a get or a bill of divorcement, could be remarried and restored to the intimate chambers of the tabernacle of Eden, providing that the contagion of death had been removed from them. This subsequent remarriage involves the issuance of a formal wedding ketubah, restoring all the Edenic rights and privileges that was yours originally. So you have to ask yourself, if death could prevent me from that, how can death be removed? We know that the provisions of the red heifer ashes, as well as the animal sacrifices of the wilderness tabernacle, could only be sufficient as a temporary fleshly cleansing that required frequent applications and could never, say that with me, never, could never offset the death penalty of Genesis chapter 3. No man could die for mankind, as the blood of that first fallen man flowed through all men. Thus, it requires a symbolic red heifer, Parah Adamah, without blemish, and upon which a yoke of death had never set, and that was required to be symbolically put in front of the people until one would arrive, and that one that arrived was the last Adam, Messiah. And it says that he became, in Hebrews chapter 9, 11 through 14, a high priest of good things to come by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands. And if y'all want to throw the book of Hebrews out so that you can use that as justification to continue to foment your plans to build the third temple, then throw it out. A tabernacle not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building, neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean sanctifies to the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Messiah, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to Yahweh, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living Elohim. I got two more I want to share with you. Parah Adamah, as the sages teach, is an incomprehensible term without an understanding of the role of Messiah. And I will stipulate, Yeshua did not, and Yeshua will not offer a red heifer. He is the Parah Adamah. If you look at that word Adamah, you can break it down. You have the word dama, which comes from the root dam, meaning blood, but the word dama means to be like and to resemble. It can also infer to cease, to be silent, to destroy, and it leaves you with the word parah. Pei, resh, hey can indicate, as we've been saying all along, to be fruitful. Our Messiah was the parah, the fruit of the lips of the Creator. Fruit is offspring. He was the firstborn, the one who resembled Yod He Vav He. On the other hand, Resh Pei He, Rapha, or Resh Pei Aleph, hints at being both weak and feeble, as well as having the ability to heal or cure. But it's also the root of the word Raphaim, the dead ones. And there's a dual reference here. The red heifer animal resembles the first Adam, weak and feeble, whose blood became silent, not able to destroy death. However, the last Adam epitomized the red heifer ritual and allowed this Adam to become fruitful again, releasing the cleansing words of the Creator that would provide protection, gone, the garden of protection, while healing or curing them from contact with the Rephaim, the dead ones in Eden, in the midst of the times and half times that are coming. Hope you've enjoyed this teaching. Shabbat Shalom.
You guys, Shalom, Shalom.